I'm going to spend some time talking about what in fact were the first showings of what we today would think of as churches. And the book of Acts tells us that from the very beginning, there was a strong church at Jerusalem. Unfortunately, if we want to know more about that, Acts moves on to a lot of other things and tells us very little about the later history of that Christian community. The rest of the New Testament offers a few other bits of information, but it mostly deals with churches in other places. So this earliest Christian community has sometimes been idealized. Peter's firmness and eloquence at Pentecost tends to make us forget the wavering he went through, trying to decide what ought to be done with Gentiles who wanted to join the church. The possession of all things in common didn't erase the tensions between the groups. Hellenists murmured against the Hebrews because their widows got neglected in the daily distribution. This is one thing that most of us probably don't ever think about when you think about the early church, and that is, in this very earliest church, they all, in effect, worked together and lived together and ate together. That is, they gathered food, prepared it, distributed it, and so that all of that was going on at the same time. In these early days, the people who are involved are all Jews. Acts makes it clear that at this early time, there are not yet any Gentiles in the church. So there were some disputes between groups, but they were both groups of Hebrews, both of Jews who kept the customs and language of their ancestors. But there were some who were beginning to show a more openness to Hellenistic influences. In Acts, this first group were called Hebrews and the other were called Hellenists. Responding to all this fuss budget, the 12 called an assembly and they appointed 7 men and were told that they were to serve tables. Exactly what that meant is not very clear, although there was no doubt that the 7 would have administrative duties to do, and the 12 would keep on preaching and teaching. It would seem that all of the 7 who were chosen were Hellenists, that is, they all had Greek names. So the naming of the 7 would seem to be an attempt to give greater voice in the affairs of the church to the Hellenistic party, while the 12, all Hebrews, would continue to be the main preachers and teachers. The 7th chapter of Acts tells us the story of Stephen, one of those 7. There is a hint in a couple of verses in the 7th chapter of Acts that his attitude toward the temple was not altogether positive. In any event, the Jewish council, composed mostly of anti-Hellenistic Jews, wouldn't listen to him at all and condemned him to death. There are obviously some things that these early groups did that present vestries are not allowed to do.
Thank God.
This contrasts with the treatment given by the same council to Peter and John, who were released after being beaten a little bit and told to shut up. Furthermore, when persecution finally broke out and Christians had to leave Jerusalem, the apostles were able to stay. When Saul left for Damascus to seek out Christians who had taken refuge there, the apostles were still in Jerusalem, and Saul evidently seemed to ignore them. So this would seem to indicate that these early persecutions were aimed mostly at the Hellenistic Christians, and the Hebrews had less trouble. After the death of Stephen, Acts turns to another of the seven, Philip, who founded a church further away in Samaria. Peter and John were then sent to exercise supervision over the life of this new community. So a church was being founded, being born beyond the area of Judea. And that church, though it was not founded by the apostles, acknowledges their authority. This is the pattern that's going to be repeated time after time as the church moves into new areas. By the 9th chapter, Acts is mostly concerned with Paul, and we don't hear much more about the church in Jerusalem. By that time, the Hellenists were serving as a bridge to the Gentile world, and Gentiles were joining the church by that time in such numbers that they completely overshadowed that earlier Jewish community. But we have to remember that the very earliest Christians were also Jews. And it's important to remember that those Christians called Hellenists in Acts were the first to show some openness to Hellenistic culture, and they were the first to get persecuted. So they were the first who got scattered through neighboring towns, and they were the first to take Christianity to those areas. One verse in the 8th chapter of Acts tells us that these Christians, quote, were all scattered throughout Judea and Samaria, that is, into these neighboring areas. Acts tells us about the visits by Peter to the Christian communities in Lydda, Sharon, and Joppa that are all in Judea. Acts 8 tells us about the work of Philip in Samaria and the visits of Peter and John. But we're also told that some of these fleeing Christians were scattered as far as Damascus, which is well beyond Judea. Even though they have moved into a variety of areas, Phoenicia, Cyprus, Antioch, they were at that point still speaking the word to no one except Jews. This issue of who should be told about Jesus was finally solved in the 10th chapter of Acts, in the episode of Peter and Cornelius, which eventually led the church at Jerusalem to the unexpected conclusion that to the Gentiles also God has granted repentance unto life. In other words, they have expanded out beyond the Jewish community. We're told then very quickly that there was a similar experience in Antioch. So the earliest expansion of the faith came as a result of Jewish Christians of Hellenistic persuasion who had to flee Jerusalem and took the good news with them. Now, they did have a fairly lengthy debate at that point within the church as to whether, if a Gentile wished to become a Christian, that Gentile first had to become a Jew. They were debating that as to whether or not this was required. Now, we do know a certain amount about Paul's travels. The book of Acts tells us about that in several chapters. For some reason that isn't explained in the scripture, Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Paul. Anybody know where Tarsus, what country Tarsus is in today? Anybody know Tarsus? Or what then was Tarsus?
In Turkey?
It's in Turkey today, on the south coast of Turkey. Anyway, Barnabas went to Tarsus. He looked for Paul. Together they spent a year or so at Antioch. And it is at that point, at Antioch, that the followers to Jesus were first called Christians. So then, in a number of missionary journeys, first with Barnabas and then with others, Paul took the gospel to Cyprus, to several cities in Asia Minor, to Greece, to Rome, and possibly, according to a tradition that cannot be proved now, possibly he went to Spain. But when we think about Paul's journeys to these places, it is not to imply that he was the first Christian to go to those places. The epistle to the Romans, for example, shows that there was a church at Rome before Paul ever went there. The spread of Christianity to Italy was such that when Paul went on a boat trip and was going to Italy, heading toward Rome, but he was landed on the coast of Italy in a tiny little village on the coast there. It's called Puteoli, just a tiny little town even today. But the scriptures show us that there were already Christians there when Paul landed there. They were already well in residence there. Now that means, as we think about it, Paul's activity is clearly a major activity for the church. But we can't exaggerate it into saying that it was the only early activity for church, or that he founded everything. Wherever he went, he was running into Christians. And the other apostles went to all kinds of places. Barnabas and Mark, for example, went to Cyprus. Apollo preached in Ephesus and Corinth in Greece. Paul's greatest contribution in the shaping of early Christianity was not so much in the actual founding of churches, so that's important. Instead, it's the epistles that he wrote that are going to become part of the Bible. I mean, you look, if you took all of Paul's letters out of the New Testament, it would be a much smaller book and tell us a lot less about things. So his work has an important and continuing impact, and so do those letters that he wrote. Besides Paul and others like Barnabas and Mark, whose names we know, there were countless others who went from place to place, taking their faith and their witness. Now, a few of these, like Paul, were basically professional missionaries. That's what he did all the time. But most of them were, without much doubt, merchants, slaves, others who traveled for various reasons. But as they traveled and met people, they talked about Christianity and spread it. We might also notice that while Paul did in fact preach to the Gentiles in large numbers, his usual procedure in coming to a new town was to go to the synagogue and the Jewish community. We also have to notice that he doesn't seem to feel that he was preaching a new faith, but rather that he was telling about the fulfillment of promises that God had made over time to Israel. His message was not that Israel had been abandoned by God, but rather that now, through the resurrection, the age of the Messiah had come, so that now Gentiles could also join the church. The New Testament does not tell us about the careers of most of the apostles. Acts tells us a little bit about the death of James, the brother of John. I'm very sensitive about James's being died.
We didn't like James.
But that Acts, after following the career of Paul for a number of years, actually just leaves him while preaching in Rome, awaiting trial. What became of Paul then, and Peter and the other apostles? From a very early time, traditions began to pop up through the church, through the various churches, claiming that at one time or another, these early apostles had preached in that region and or had been martyred there in one manner or another. It would seem that most of these traditions are in fact an effort by churches in a particular town to claim that they were founded by an apostle. They wanted to be the upper bunch of churches. Some of them may very well be true, for all we know. Maybe a lot of them are. Of all these traditions, the most trustworthy is probably the one that affirms that Peter was in Rome and that he was martyred there during the time of Nero. On these points, then, that there are several writers of the 1st and 2nd centuries who agree with that. We're also told that he was crucified. One of the versions of his crucifixion has him being crucified upside down. I don't know whether that'd be worse or not. Either one of them seems very good.
Actually, I've heard that he died sooner that way. That was because the blood drained down or whatever.
You'd
And
think
he
he
did it
might,
in order
yeah.
to
Could
not
be.
like Jesus, but theory, at least I've heard that he would have died quicker.
Yeah. The case of Paul seems a little more complex. The book of Acts leaves him while he was preaching in Rome. Ancient writers agree in several cases that he died in Rome and that he probably was beheaded. That would have been something that he had coming to him because he was a Roman citizen.
Yeah.
But it also, there are others who say he undertook some journeys that aren't mentioned in Acts, including that trip to Spain. All we can say for certain is that nothing is really known for certain about Paul between the end of the book of Acts and his death in the time of Nero.
How many years was that? I mean, the time frame?
I'm sorry?
When was Nero the emperor? And what time frame were we talking about?
Let me think. I can't offhand come up with the years for
Didn't
Nero.
Nero die in 64,
Pardon?
something like that?
Nero.
I can't remember when he started being the emperor, but I'm pretty sure he stopped in
if I can-
64, the Common Era, 64 AD.
See if I can figure it out here.
While you're looking him up,
Nero was emperor from 37 to 68.
68, okay,
Cool, thank you.
so almost 30 years,
Yeah.
29 years.
Anyway, at least we can look him up. Most of us can't look ourselves up.
That's good.
Yeah. Anyway, Paul's case is a little more complex. The book of Acts leaves him in Rome. But there are other writers who talk about things there, including a trip to Spain. We just don't know anything much about that. The job of reconstructing John's later career is complicated by the fact that there are so many Johns in the early records. There's an ancient tradition that has been around for centuries that says when John was executed, he was thrown into a pot of boiling oil. That would not have been much fun. But the book of Revelation puts him at about the same time on exile on an island called Patmos. So we just don't know. Another tradition, which in some ways is very trustworthy, speaks of John as a teacher in Ephesus and tells us that he died around 100 there. What this means very likely is all these things are talking about more than one John, so that it's hard to know which ones apply to that particular John. By the middle or later part of the 2nd century, there was a development that hinders the task of knowing about the history of the apostles, because in all over the empire, big cities that were having now churches full of Christians, all of those important churches are claiming that they were founded by an apostle. They all wanted to be apostolic churches. The church at Alexandria wanted to have an apostolic founder, and so they had St. Mark come. Then when Constantinople became a capital city in the empire, they took up Philip and said he had founded their church. Now, according to a long tradition, James proclaimed the gospel without very much success in Galicia and Saragossa. On his way back, according to this tradition, the Virgin appeared to him standing on a pillar and gave him encouragement. That is the origin of this Virgin of the Pillar that is so common in Spain. If you travel much, particularly through smaller towns in Spain, virtually every one of them is going to have someplace downtown a pillar with a statue of the Virgin on it.
Huh.
It is a very Spanish habit. Back in Jerusalem, James is recorded as being beheaded by people of Herod. And then his remains were supposedly taken back to Compostela, where many think he's buried. Taking remains back on a trip is not at all a common thing. Hardly anybody thinks, I think I'll pack up that dead body, take it with me. But I suppose it could have happened. But the Spanish certainly think it did, and will be very buzzed with you if you don't believe them. There is even a tradition, of course, that Thomas visited India. That story appears for the first time in a book called The Acts of Thomas, which may have been written as early as the end of the 2nd century. There's probably nothing to it, but those things happen. Most of these tales about apostolic founding pop up at a later time when it was being believed that the apostles had simply divided up the known world and popped out to all of it to make sure everybody was Christian. Probably nothing much to it. But probably the founding of churches in all those areas done by faithful Christians whose names we don't know and never will. They just did the work. They weren't out for a reputation. They just wanted to spread Christianity. Now, that brings us to a point, to an interesting question. How did, over time, a tiny and originally obscure little cult from the edge of the empire push away classical paganism and become the dominant faith of Western civilization? That certainly happened, whether we can fill in all the details or not. Does that mean it has to grow at a rate that is incredible and unknown in modern experience? For example, for a starting number, there is a notation in the 14th verse of the 1st chapter of Acts that suggests that after the crucifixion, there were 120 Christians. Now, how reliable that number is a little difficult to come up with, but they say that. Later, in the 4th chapter of Acts, they say there were 5,000 Christians. The 21st chapter of Acts has a verse that says that by the 6th decade of the 1st century, many thousands of Jews in Jerusalem now believed. That is because they were Christian. Those are obviously not statistics. If that had been true, Jerusalem would have been the first Christian city. Now, estimates of the total population of Jerusalem in those days, anybody have any idea how big Jerusalem was? It varies a little bit in notations and all, between 10 and 20,000. It is not a major city, obviously. So many thousands is not a literal number in antiquity. That happens all the time. I remember several years ago, there was a big fuss because an article in a Toronto magazine insisted that there were 10,000 Hare Krishna in that city. 10,000. The correct number, as later worked out carefully, was 80. Anyway, in the middle of the 3rd century, there is a writer of that time who say that Christians made up just a few of the population. 60 years later, Christianity was so prevalent that the Emperor Constantine, evidently for political purposes, felt that it was necessary for him to become a Christian. If all these folks are going to be Christians, then I'm going to be their leader. Some historians think about 10% of the population of the empire was Christian in Constantine's time. The total population of the Roman Empire in his day was about 60 million.
Whoa.
That would mean that you had to have about 6 million Christians. If we postulate that we have to go up to 6 million by that time frame, if we were following that notion, that would mean there were about 7,500 Christians there in the year 100, 217,000 some odd in 200, and a little over 6 million in 300, if they're growing at that rate, which is, I suppose, possible. What we think of is this now, the historians today think that in the year 40, there were about 1,000 Christians. In the year 50, about 1,400. In the year 100, about 7,500. In the year 150, just short of 41,000. 200, a little over 200,000. 250, a little over 1 million. In the year 300, over 6 million.
Wow.
And in the year 350, more than 33 million. They're signing them up. Now, if you look at those numbers, those increases, that is in fact about the percentage growth of the Mormon church in the last 100 years.
Mhm.
They're growing about that fast. When do we have to quit?
In about 5 minutes.
Okay. One other thing I'd like to talk about a little bit here is the class basis of early Christianity. Conventional wisdom over a long period of time assumed that Christianity was originally a movement of the dispossessed. So it was the kind of thing that slaves would join, impoverished people would join. That idea was very popular in some areas. German historians, for example, in the 19th and 20th centuries, took that up and said they thought it was true. Some of them claimed that all religions are always the work of the lower orders of people, the lowest classes of people. And they picked out, to justify that view, a verse in 1 Corinthians, which quotes St. Paul as saying that not many of the wise, mighty, or noble were called. That view is, in our day, has been very widely discarded. It is now believed and demonstrated, I think, accurately, that many people who were well off and well born were attracted to the church in its early years. It is now believed that the earliest church was based largely on middle and upper classes. Now, we have to remember, when you talk about upper class people, middle class people becoming Christians, many of those people have servants, slaves, households. If any upper class person became a Christian, he always called a meeting of the household and said, "You're all Christians now." So you have to put that in, that these people had slaves, they had servants, and if they were converted, all of them were counted.
Yeah, a whole household would be baptized, like the centurion's household.
Wasn't much of the influence also because the women joined the church first? And then, like Constantine's mother,
Yeah, well,
I'm sure it was a huge influence on his conversion.
if your mother tells you to do something, you don't have much choice.
The first
At any
it's the
rate.
mother, and then it's the head of the household telling his underling that they got to join.
If you look at a lot of the things that were written, missals and letters, that sort of thing, analyses, you look at a lot of things that were written in the early church, the majority of them were addressed to a literate, well-educated audience. So that, I think, gives us that notion. I think we better quit here.
Well, also, all the traveling we talked about, they have to have means to do that traveling. They
Yeah.
get supposed to go to Rome or whatever.
Well, and if you think about it, if you're thinking about Christianity attracts attractive, well-educated, lovable people.
But the Christians
Anyway.
who call the apostle that, well, I guess some of them were of these too. There was a tax collector, which was that Levi figure. But others were lowly fishermen, so.
Anyway, we'll take a look. We'll spend a few moments next time too, also looking at, I got a couple of maps of some of the journeys of Paul and people like that. We'll take a look at them next time. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.